Good evening, everyone. My name is John McKinnon. I'm the acting chair of the Department of Philosophy at St. Mary's University, and I'm pleased to welcome you this evening to this year's annual Marshall Lecture in Public Philosophy. This series was inaugurated in March 2001 when Dr. James Young of the University of Victoria delivered a talk on the issue of cultural appropriation in the arts. Since then, we have welcomed a number of scholars from across the United States and Canada who have addressed a range of topics of public interest, including the proper limits of judicial interpretation of written law, social trust and the war on terror, children's rights in the home, evil and inexcusable wrongs, and social and legal accommodation of religious diversity. Throughout, we have enjoyed generous and enthusiastic support from the Dean of Arts, Dr. Esther Enns, from the Vice President Academic, in years past, Dr. Terry Murphy, and more recently, Dr. David Gauthier, and of course, Dr. Colin Dodds, President of St. Mary's. On behalf of the Department of Philosophy, I'd like to thank them all. Every year, though, we're especially determined to recognize the contribution of Dr. Rowland Marshall, who taught philosophy at St. Mary's for over 30 years, and who was, for about 25 of those years, along with his late wife, Margot, what he describes as a partner in modest philanthropy, endowing a number of prizes, bursaries, and scholarships for St. Mary's students. The annual lecture in public philosophy is a natural extension of these commitments to the university, having grown out of a respect for philosophy and the view that philosophy demands and deserves a public place. It was a generous gift from Rowland and Margot Marshall that got this lecture series, which now bears their family name, off the ground. So I'd like to ask Dr. Marshall to stand so we can all recognize both his and his wife's generosity and foresight. In 2009, our invited lecturer proposed to address the topic of our moral obligation to the starving. In June of that year, it occurred to me that I had better contact CCEPA, the Canadian Centre for Ethics and Public Affairs, to ensure that we avoid a scheduling conflict, if only because a lot of the people who are drawn to CCEPA events are drawn to or would be drawn to our own. So I emailed Chris Stover, General Manager of CCEPA, whom at that point I had never met. Within minutes, I received an excited reply, not just reassuring me about our scheduling, but offering to co-sponsor that year's lecture. Since then, the Department of Philosophy and CCEPA have been partners in this annual event, and for us, certainly, it has been a welcome and auspicious arrangement, not least because of the pleasure of dealing with Chris herself, whose energy, good cheer, and thoughtfulness in every sense of that term have been responsible for making CCEPA the great success that it has become. Speaking of CCEPA, I would now like to call on Michael Scott to say a few words. In addition to serving as member of CCEPA's board, Mr. Scott is a president of Precision Biologic, a Halifax-based firm that develops, manufactures, and markets products used to diagnose blood coagulation disorders. Michael.
Good evening, everyone. So I'm Michael Scott. I'm a member of the CCEPA board, and on behalf of the board and the staff of the Centre, I'd like to welcome you here tonight. CCEPA, as I think you know at this point, is an organization co-founded by St. Mary's and the Atlantic School of Theology. CCEPA's mandate is to provide an arena for critical thinking, public discussion, and research into current ethical challenges in our society. CCEPA does this by presenting public lectures, conversations, and debates designed to inform and debate and facilitate informed choices, and also to mediate ethical concerns through a process of critical listening and engagement. CCEPA also supports ethics research and assists organizations and individuals in the integration of ethics into public practices and policies. In a moment, I'll hand things over to Dr. Lisa Gannett, a professor in the philosophy department here at St. Mary's, who will provide a detailed introduction of our speaker tonight. But before I do that, I'd like to thank, on behalf of the board, our co-sponsors for this event, the Rowland Marshall Public Lecture Fund, and the Office of the President, the Academic Vice President, and the Office of the Dean of Arts of St. Mary's University. I'd also like to welcome tonight our live stream audience who are participating in this event, and I'd like to invite those of you who are participating that way to join in the question period through the chat feature on your screen. And I'd encourage you to use the evaluation option and also on your screen so you can let us know what you think about tonight's event. This feedback is extremely helpful to CCEPA in deciding and determining what kind of events are most appropriate in the future. For those of you in the room, there's an evaluation process, and I'd ask you to leave that when you leave the room. Also, as you leave the auditorium tonight, please check out some of the information about CCEPA on the table at the back of the room, and feel free to help yourself to any of the DVDs of past programs that are on display there, as well as information about what's upcoming. So now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Lisa Gallagher.
I'm very, very pleased to introduce Dr. Sarah Richardson, who is speaking to us today about gender, science, and social values, specifically how social assumptions about gender are implicated in genome-based research into biological sex differences. When I picked up Dr. Richardson at the airport yesterday evening, she told me that she was greeted by a border service agent who asked her many questions about her visit, where she was speaking, what she was speaking about, where she was staying, and so forth. At one point he asked, "And what is it about you that would lead to an invitation to speak here?" Well, Dr. Richardson is a modest person, and rather than recite her many accomplishments, she merely said that she is a feminist scholar doing feminist scholarship, hoping that even Canadian border services might fear to tread there. However, I will take a few moments to tell you about Dr. Richardson's research program and the accolades that have come her way. And by doing so, I think it will become evident why the philosophy department at St. Mary's invited her to give the 2013 Marshall Lecture in Public Philosophy, and why we are so delighted that she accepted the invitation. Dr. Richardson is a historian and philosopher of science who focuses on the social dimensions of scientific knowledge, especially how social assumptions about gender and race influence research in the biosciences. Dr. Richardson brings an impressive interdisciplinary background to her work. She has a BA in philosophy from Columbia University and a PhD from the program in modern thought and literature at Stanford University. And she is presently an assistant professor at Harvard University, where she is jointly appointed to the History of Science and Studies of Women, Gender, and Sexuality departments. Dr. Richardson has a forthcoming book based on her dissertation research, which is being published by University of Chicago Press and will be available in November. Titled Sex Itself, Male and Female in the Human Genome, the book traces the history of genetic theories of sex differences from 1900 to the present, to show how the X and Y chromosomes became gendered objects that fixed sex binarism in the genome. It has already met with rave reviews from leading historians and philosophers of biology. For example, Evelyn Fox Keller describes it as an excellent study of the role of gender in human genomics, which fills a perplexing and crucial gap in the literature of gender and science. And John Dupre commends the skill, sensitivity, and elegance of Dr. Richardson's analysis. Dr. Richardson is the author of 2 prize-winning essays, a 2008 chapter titled When Gender Criticism Becomes Standard Scientific Practice, won the Marjorie Lozoff Graduate Essay Prize, and a 210 article in Biology and Philosophy titled Sex, Species, and Genomes, Why Males and Females Are Not Like Humans and Chimpanzees, won the inaugural Philosophy of Science Association Women's Caucus Prize. Dr. Richardson has a special knack for identifying areas of scientific research that call out for the savvy, historical, and philosophical interventions she is able to deliver. Her 2001 essay, Race and IQ in the Post-Genomic Age, which appeared in Biosocieties, emphasizes the need for scientists to critically and openly discuss community standards for research into racial and ethnic differences and frequencies of genes postulated to be involved in cognition. Dr. Richardson's recurrent research includes a book project on the history of maternal effects research in the life sciences from 1900 to the present, and an investigation of how narratives of racial difference and primitivism are implicated in recent studies of genetic introgression between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Without further delay, please join me in welcoming Dr. Sarah Richardson.
Wow. From Lisa Gannett, those are really wonderful things to hear because she has been such a nice mentor to me in my career and really exemplifies a publicly engaged philosopher. So let me thank you so much for this wonderful invitation. And special thanks not only to Lisa Gannett, but to Chris Stover of CCEPA, and to Todd Calder, and to John McKinnon of SMU for making this possible. Let me begin by locating myself. The invitation to give a lecture in public philosophy is a rare thing for an academic to get, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity, and I hope what I do is what you hoped for, Dr. Marshall. I'm going to locate myself within a particular tradition, a tradition that I call feminist epistemology, where scholars over the last 30 years or so have developed a form of scholarship that is situated, that is embodied, that is interested in accountable knowledge, producing scholarship that, in short, matters, and that starts from the lives and experiences of subjugated and marginal people, and is interested in producing transformative conversations, an ethical practice of scholarship. In particular, within that arena of investigation, I want to introduce a practice or a methodology that I'll call gender analysis of science. Now, I'm introducing a big term there, gender. What do I mean by that term? When I say gender, as opposed to sex, for example, I'm referring to the norms and expectations associated with maleness and femaleness, masculinity and femininity, and sexual orientation in a particular culture. Mostly I'll be referring to Western culture. And through gender analysis of science, we're interested in how those cultural assumptions about gender enter into and play a role in the cognitive practice of science. So when I refer to what I do as gender analysis of science, it means that I'm doing a close, systematic, and critical analysis of an area of scientific study with attention to the category of gender. And the way that I have preferred to do this is to do it in a very grounded way. So to work through case studies, to get deeply into the science, to embed myself in scientific communities and in the scientific literature, to show the many ways that gender works in and through science. I believe that we can learn something very important about how science operates in its social context by looking through the window of gender. I also believe that we can learn something very interesting about gender by looking at the way that gender expectations, norms, and assumptions play a role even in our most elite areas of knowledge production, the genetic biosciences. To deepen a little bit what I mean by gender analysis of science, let me give this kind of schematic of how gender has been shown to work within science in a lot of different case studies. So systematic and critical sensitivity to the category of gender in science has shown, for example, how schemas from society about the binary of maleness and femaleness are imposed onto our research on human sex differences. For example, in brain research or in hormonal research, where we see in popular media pictures of pink brains and blue brains, or we see the strong binary of testosterone and estrogen typed as the male and female hormones. We start with assuming a sex binary, and then we do our research in that frame, neglecting the variation within each sex and the overlap between those two groups. What do we end up with? Research that confirms our initial assumptions that we entered into the program with. So I mean by gender analysis of science the practice of making visible how that happens by close analysis of the language, visual representation, theories, models, and practices of science. Let me give some examples of recent literature in this highly interdisciplinary field to which I'm referring. Here are an array of powerfully influential books offering original, creative criticisms, engaged criticisms of research in a variety of scientific fields. For example, this book by Elizabeth Lloyd, The Case of the Female Orgasm, looks at the way in which androcentrism, that is, a focus on a male model of sexuality, has led to the under-theorization of the role of the female orgasm in primate sexuality. So I believe that this literature indicates a new openness and a new urgency to the kinds of questions that I'm looking at. It used to be that researchers, critics of gender bias in science, were thought of as anti-science and as way out on the margins. And what I'm seeing now is a new openness, a new concern about gender bias in science, a concern about the ethics of it, but also what we call the epistemic consequences, meaning the consequences for the scientific knowledge itself. What all of these scholars have been very effective at doing is showing how there are perils for the science itself if we ignore the way that gender can play a role in knowledge. So this literature represents a kind of backdrop for my inquiry today. Now, you might say, gosh, what you're saying is terrible. How can gender play a role in scientific knowledge? And if it does play a role, isn't that really a rare aberration that represents a terrible abuse of science? Well, it would be if this represents your picture of science. That is, if you believe that science is a process of formulating a hypothesis, gathering data, and producing scientific facts. But what I want to introduce you to is a new way of thinking about science that philosophers and social epistemologists have innovated over the last couple of decades. In this new way of thinking about science, we understand that science is the process of making inferences under conditions of uncertainty, what philosophers call underdetermination. Now, this process of making inferences under conditions of uncertainty is also within a social context and within a social dialogical process. So we no longer think in philosophy of science that this is the picture of how science works. Instead, we tend to understand science as much more processual and full of social and other kinds of cognitive assumptions that play a role in the way that we reason in science. So scientific findings under a picture informed by the theory of underdetermination are underdetermined by the evidence. That is, there's a gap between the evidence we have and the theories that we hold to be true or likely to be true. What happens in that gap is we bring in our own background assumptions. Some are explicit and we bring them to the table, and some are more implicit and rarely discussed and made transparent. So in this picture, you have a process where you're generating new hypotheses from old hypotheses. It's a much more contingent and dynamic process, moving between many layers of inference and forms of explanation. To deepen this picture of underdetermination, let's think about science more broadly as a social practice. In this flowchart, which might be a little hard to read from a distance, this flowchart shows kind of a production of knowledge model, right? Where you start with certain points, certain assumptions, for example, global models, the formulation of research questions, but then there are all sorts of values and norms and social practices that are an ineliminable part of this process. Disciplinary training, peer review, the technologies you have available for inference and observation. Once we begin to look closely at how science actually works, we see that it's a highly socially contingent practice, where when we reason from point to point in making our scientific arguments, there are lots of spaces where our social assumptions become resources for scientific argument. Let's deepen this further by returning to gender. If we understand that science as a social practice, if we agree that underdetermination is an important part of scientific inference making, then we can see many places where gender assumptions, understood as part of the context, as we might call contextual values, can influence science, can play a role in science. And so hence, paying attention to gender can be very, very illuminating. Just to give a few examples, gender assumptions as contextual values might affect the practices in an area of science, the questions we choose to ask, the way that we describe the data, specific assumptions as well as global assumptions that determine the character of research in a field. So locating this talk in my work, which I'm going to talk about with you today, and hopefully analyze with you this emerging area of genomic research on sex differences. In my forthcoming book on gender in the human genome, I track the emergence of a new and distinctive way of thinking about sex, represented by the unalterable, simple, and visually compelling binary of the X and Y chromosomes. In this book, I examine, through a series of close case studies of episodes in the history of this area of research, the interaction between cultural gender norms and genetic theories of sex from the beginning of the 20th century to the present post-genomic age. So, while the sex hormones have been the overwhelming focus of scientific research as well as feminist studies of sexual science in the 20th century, the genetic account of sex has somehow received far less attention. I analyze the sex chromosomes, the X and Y chromosomes, as gendered objects of scientific knowledge. That is, the X is often thought of as the female chromosome and the Y as the male chromosome. And in doing so, I add gender to our intellectual histories of human genetics, and I add analysis of genetics to our theories of sex and gender. So my argument in the book is that gender conceptions have indeed influenced the direction of sex chromosome genetics, from the earliest theories of chromosomal sex determination to the mid-century hypothesis, some of you may have heard about, of the XYY, extra aggressive and violent super male, to the long-standing belief that the X is the female chromosome, even though both males and females have an X chromosome, to the recent claim that males and females have different genomes and are even so different they are like different species, like humans and chimpanzees. Finally, I show how the X and Y emerged from a raucous century of changes in our conceptions of sex differences and gender roles. It sure has been quite a century, right? As the basis of a hierarchical conceptual layer, or a hierarchy, I guess, a conceptual hierarchy of sex to gender that moves from hard to soft, from chromosomal or genotypic sex, then hormonal, then gonadal, then morphological sex, and finally gender presentation and sexual orientation. So this work I'm describing today is actually very recent. I'm going to talk about very recent emerging science. And it represents the tail end of this story. So it's really since the 1990s or so that we've begun to enter what we might call the genomic age, and with the completion of the genome sequencing projects, we might even say the post-genomic age. So with you, I'm going to be looking at very recent developments in the genomic science of sex differences since the completion of the sequencing of the human genome. Now, it's striking that sex difference has not been a more central focus of discussion among those studying the implications of genetics. It is, after all, a widely shared consensus among social scientists that genomics is transforming social relations and social categories. It is remaking categories of identity, concepts such as blood relations, racial or geographic ancestry, citizenship and subjectivity, as well as notions of what it means to be normal and healthy, what rights we have to privacy and health care, what responsibilities we have to others to maintain and pursue information about our health, Now, research on the genomic conception of race, a topic with which I have also been deeply engaged, provides a helpful analog for the investigation of gender in the age of the genome. So I apologize for this incredibly text-heavy slide, but what I want to convey is the force of all the kinds of questions scholars have seen as legitimate and valuable and important to ask about how new genomic technologies are recasting forms of racial difference. Now, this research has shown the revival of old, debunked models of race in the language of genomics. And research on race and genomics underscores the ways in which trends in areas such as pharmacogenomics, personalized medicine, and health movements for racial and ethnic minorities are supporting what we might say is an often uncritical turn toward research on race-specific genetics. I want to suggest that the same may be said of genetic research on sex and gender. So here are some of the starting questions we might ask as publicly engaged philosophers thinking about emerging science. So what are the implications of sequencing the human genome for our understanding of human sex and gender? By our understanding, I mean our broad public conversation about male and female sex differences, about gender, and about sexuality. We also need to ask and become very familiar with what are the methods, aims, and empirical claims of this area of research, and let's place it in its context. What are the relevant historical frameworks, philosophical frameworks, and social and ethical questions raised by this research? One frame for my inquiry today is a historical one. In my field, we call research on sex differences throughout time a body of research that we call it sexual science. So I'll stick with that fun little term. And in investigations of sexual science, we have shown in history of science how different eras have produced different models of sex differences. So gender scholars have shown that in a given era, the concept of sex differences tends to correspond to the favored technologies and conceptions of the body of the time. Now, we can see how over time, as scientists had access to and favored certain tissues or forms of analysis, biometric forms of analysis, sexual science has shifted its center of gravity from investigations of blood to skeleton to skulls, brains, most recently hormones, and we might suggest today we are moving into a genomic era. The relevance of pointing out this rupture, this shift to a new technology for describing sex and gender differences is that one of the insights of our histories of sexual science is that the redescription of sex differences in a new modality at a time of rupture does not eviscerate the fundamental problems of reasoning encountered in the past. Instead, often, if we learn from history, we learn that shifts to new technologies tend to start the debate over from the beginning. It reinvigorates those questions, sometimes with less criticality about the assumptions we're bringing to the table. So, again, these patterns of overstating difference between the sexes, understating the variety within each sex, and reinforcing sexual stereotypes can be seen as being revived each time we move to a new technology, which gives us reason to apply a strong ethical frame to the emergence of new technologies for describing human difference. Now, here's another frame for thinking about the science I'm going to describe today, and that is our present thinking about the science and future prospects of genomics. Today, as biomedical scientists work in a transdisciplinary research environment, framed in part by the interests and agendas of commercial pharmaceutical firms, biotechnology, direct-to-consumer genetics enterprises, they are driven to apply human genetic data and technologies to locate variation in the human genome that may be marketable as a biomarker of disease, for forensics, for ancestry determination, or for human enhancement. So we need to ask, how is this promiscuous environment altering our picture of biological sex differences. Now, in the context of the data deluge of the post-genomic era, it should be noted that sex is a ubiquitously available variable in epidemiological research. It's been shown by the race and genetics scholars that race or biogeographical ancestry is among the principal tools for probing the human genome for differences. And as I shall argue here, too, sex is becoming a prominent category for genomic analysis. So the data is readily available, as genetic samples are routinely tagged with the sex of the donor. And even, of course, when sex isn't available, genotyping will usually readily reveal the donor's sex. So this makes it easy to mine genetic data for sex differences, even when it was not originally collected for that purpose. As such, human genome data and technologies could be said to be poised to proliferate scientific claims of biological sex differences. Now, I want to argue that we are indeed seeing a shift to a genomic conception of sex in the primary sex difference research literature. So the classic view of the relationship of the production, I should say, of biological sex differences is one that put hormones very much at the center. So you may have learned in high school biology that, yes, there are the sex chromosomes, and there's even this gene on the Y chromosome called the SRY, and that these genes initiate sex determination in the embryo. But after that, it's all hormones. You form the appropriate gonad. You then produce the appropriate ratio of so-called sex steroids, and you produce a typical fertile male or female. What I am seeing in the emerging genomic conception of sex differences is that hormones no longer hold the key. They're very important, but they've been decentered. In this new account, genes emerge as the co-equal and even primary actors in sex differences. In other words, you can observe a redescribing of the hormonal picture of sex differences in genetic terms in the primary literature. Genes are no longer second fiddle to the sex hormones, but phenomena that we once described in hormonal terms, we now want to find in genetic terms. So whereas the genetics of sex was once thought of as limited to the sex chromosomes and gonad-determining genes, now we understand the whole genome as imbued with sex-specific processes and sex differences in gene expression. Where hormones were the primary mediators of sex differences and sex-specific processes throughout the life course, now you're redescribing these dynamic processes in the life course as actually being centrally genetic ones. Whereas sex hormones once governed gene action in accounts of sex-specific traits, now we understand genes as directly mediating or governing sex hormone action. So now I'm going to get a little sociological on you. As I describe this new field, it's unavoidable that there are social factors driving the new interest in sex differences. This new genomic account of sex, that is not just the result of the march of scientific discoveries. It is an artifact of new descriptive and analytical genomic technologies sweeping through the biological sciences and producing reams of new information about human differences. It is also the explicit product of funding and institutional shifts brought about by a new women's health agenda. Now, I identify three central elements shaping the emerging genomic landscape of sex difference research. This shifting women's health agenda, which I'll talk about in a moment, these technological imperatives, which I'll then turn to, and also what I call new research platforms, which I won't have time to discuss as much today, but just to briefly point to that area, there are areas of rich social investment right now, such as in autism research and in a new field called epigenetics. And these areas are contributing to a new interest in sex difference research. Okay, so Sociologist Stephen Epstein, in his recent book, Inclusion, documents how social justice health movements in both the area of race and ethnicity and women's health have subtly and then explicitly moved over the last 10 years or so from the goal of the inclusion of sexual minorities in research, right? So the old goal used to be, let's actually do research on women as well as men. But the agenda has shifted in recent years from the inclusion of sexual minorities in research to the vigorous promotion of research on sexual and racial differences. So having achieved the initial aim of ensuring that subjects of different races and sexes were included in biomedical research, the leading edge of these movements is shifting. It is now arguing for explicit investment in sex and race different studies. So this vigorous return to sex differences is promoted in part by shifts in the leadership and the priorities of the women's health movement and alliances of genomic sex difference researchers with the women's health movement. As I'm going to show, this shift can be seen intellectually and institutionally in the founding of new centers, journals, and organizations over the last decade. And the outcome is a set of catchphrases: sex-based biology, sex-specific and gender-specific research, the language in part of personalized medicine and also of redressing research injustices, but with the possible outcome of an uncritical search for and generation of findings of sex differences with unclear implications for any of these goals. I'm going to just focus on one extremely powerful organization in this movement, the Society for Women's Health Research in Washington, D.C., a national nonprofit organization that has had a huge influence, even internationally, on the framing of this new field. This organization has played a direct leadership role in the rise over the past decade of the discipline of sex-based biology. The Society for Women's Health Research dubbed this agenda for systematic basic biological research in sex differences in health and disease, sex-based biology. And this vision that they have of women's health calls for a top-to-bottom research agenda on the systematic ways in which women's biology differs from men's in order to identify male-female differences that might be relevant to human health. The first milestone in these efforts was the 2001 Institute of Medicine report. This is sociologically interesting for thinking about processes, social processes in scientific knowledge production. This is a consensus report. Sometimes decisions are made locally by individual reasoners, but sometimes they're made by huge societies trying to develop a consensus to drive research forward. This 288-page document, featuring a high-resolution image of the human sex chromosomes on its cover, asserted that, quote, every cell has a sex, and that sex differences should be studied in all parts of the human body, in all animal models, and in all areas of health and disease, quote, from womb to tomb. A decade later, just a few years ago, the IOM released a 10th anniversary report updating this one and reiterating and restating its original conclusions and aims. Just read a quote from the report's executive summary. The focus of this report is on sex-based differences versus sex-based similarities, as they are more likely to successfully demonstrate the need for further research and lead to greater understanding of the significance of sex in human biology and health. So the difference paradigm really drove this new kind of focus on sex-based biology. Now, the Society for Women's Health Research, their efforts to develop sex-based biology as a research field have been impressively savvy. So let's think sociologically about science. In 1990, the Society established its challenge to women's absence from clinical research trials. In 1996, it submitted a research proposal to the Institute of Medicine to support sex-based biology and the production of the 2001 Institute of Medicine report that I just described, which after that, they held for 7 years a series of conferences, the Sex and Gene Expression Conferences, in which they built an intellectual community. They then founded the Organization for the Study of Sex Differences out of that society, which led in 2010 to the founding of a journal. So all the artifacts of a scientific field, the forms of recognition, community building, all that is necessary socially to produce a new research agenda. So creating a discipline, creating avenues for publication, awards, and fellowships. So let me briefly take a look at the mission statement for the journal Biology of Sex Differences. Again, we get this intense focus on differences as a discipline in itself, the focus being on the molecular and biological level, and looking at sex differences as a conceptual framework in and of itself for scientific research. And you will note that the priority research areas are in genetics and genomics. So there's a relationship between the driving new technology of genomics and the development of this new focus on sex differences. Now, this effort, let's widen the picture even more, could not have been successful without the support of major funders. If you look at the website for the Society for Women's Health Research and the Organization for the Study of Sex Differences, you will find, and I've just added a few here, the representation of every major biomedical, medical biotech, and pharmaceutical corporation. Now, interest in associating themselves with women's health is not something that I have assessed in my own research. There's certainly the case that these firms are looking hard for biomarkers that could support the repackaging of their products for specific subgroups, a lucrative strategy that has become central to a pharmaceutical industry facing a slowing pipeline. Okay, so we have some context here. But quite apart from the activities of a certain elite, politically connected sector of the women's health movement, with scientists in their leadership, there are simple imperatives that follow from the new possibilities opened up by genomic technologies and the huge amounts of genomic data now becoming available. And I've just arrayed some examples of primary research studies looking at sex differences, genetic sex differences, and sex differences in the human genome and in model organism genomes like the mouse. And I call this the imperatives of the data landscape. There's a way in which the availability of quantitative technologies and the ease of providing comparisons using these technologies produces a new wave of kind of easy scholarship, right? An interest in, let's find the differences. Let's do a first probe. Let's search the database, right? Now, in 2005, the complete sequence of the human X chromosome was published in Science magazine. And in the weeks following the publication of the article, you saw a lot of speculation on what this human X chromosome sequence would afford us in terms of new knowledge about sex differences. One researcher, Huntington Willard, the director of the Institute for Genome Studies at Duke University, interpreted the results of this sequencing as showing that human males and females differ by, quote, 2%, greater than the hereditary gap between humankind and its closest relative, the chimpanzee. He concluded, and this is really quite provocative and revolutionary, there is not one human genome, the promise of the 1990s Human Genome Projects, but two, male and female. Another commentator, Mark Ross, and I've had the chance to interview and meet all of these people who are very well-intentioned and excellent scientists in the process of my research, but he said, Now that we've got the sequence of both sex chromosomes, we can do a very detailed comparison to really ask the differences between male and female. This is Mark Ross of the Sanger Institute, who actually ran the X chromosome sequencing effort. So, in short, sex chromosome geneticists, and not marginal ones, but big ones in the field, frequently present genetic analysis of the X and Y chromosome as offering, at last, the real story of, the final word on human sex difference. And in these words, I find this new impulse to quantify differences between males and females in the human genome. Now, using new genomic and bioinformatic technologies, geneticists are now able to ask a range of questions about sex differences in the human genome. Now, in the unsettled technology of the field, these questions include looking at sex-dependent gene expression. Are there differences in the genes that express in human tissues, depending whether they are in a male body or in a female body? Another question is sex-biased gene expression. Same gene in a male body and a female body, does it express, meaning activate, produce protein product at different levels? Sex-specific genetic pathways. So are the sets of genes and the networks and the pathways and the architecture behind let's say, Alzheimer's in females, is it different than in males? So those are a few examples of the kinds of really interesting questions that this new technology suggests we might be able to answer soon. There's a huge industry of just comparing sex-specific gene expression and pathways, tissue by tissue and disease by disease. So theories of the genetic etiology of diseases ranging from autism, schizophrenia, and major depression to cardiovascular disease and diabetes now invoke sex-biased gene expression or sex-dependent genetic effects or pathways. Unfortunately, these studies are full of problems. I'm going to spend some time describing the results of a 2007 study by Patsopoulos, Tatsioni, and Ioannidis in the Journal of the American Medical Association. The authors are well-known biostatisticians, and they analyzed 432 claims of genetic sex differences in 77 recent peer-reviewed research articles. Their findings are remarkable. After statistical reanalysis using the raw study data where it was available, they found that 55.9% of the published claims were not statistically significant. In addition, in all but 12.7% of the articles, the studies contained serious flaws in design. They concluded that 74 of the claims were wholly spurious, and only 37 of the claims were, quote, stated to rely on a priori considerations, had raw data available that documented that they were indeed nominally statistically significant, and had analyses performed on the whole study sample. In the end, Patsopoulos et al. Found only 2 claims that met all of their criteria for an internally sound finding of sex differences, and also had been replicated by at least one other study. So the conclusions of this study were as follows. There are endemic problems in genetic sex difference studies. There's the problem of lack of replication, but there's also seems to be an endemic problem of poor study design, a lack of controls, and inadequately powered subgroup analysis. What that means is subgroups, males and females in a study, are subgroups, and you need them to be big enough to be able to make a claim about difference. This is a huge problem in this field, being able to have a big enough sample to make a claim about sex differences. They conclude that gene-sex differences are likely to be rare, small, and difficult to corroborate based on their study. In genetic studies, they argued, related to sex, the vast majority of claimed subgroup differences are likely to be chance findings. So if that's not enough for you, I did a qualitative literature review looking at the 20 most cited, highly cited peer-reviewed articles during the decade 2001 to 2011. I was looking at things like the figures, the language used to describe results, and here are 5 central findings. First of all, the differences reported were extremely small. The larger standard in the field of gene expression studies is that you need to have at least 2-fold differences in gene expression for it to be biologically meaningful. So let's just step back and say, it's easy to find differences. We could divide this room down the middle and find some significant difference, I believe, between one side of the auditorium and the other side of the auditorium. But the question is the meaning of that difference. What does it mean? And these studies provide very, very small findings of difference that are not greater, that are under 2-fold. Therefore, the suggestion is that the functional implications of these findings may be very small. I should note, by the way, there's one gene that expresses hugely differently between males and females. That gene is a special gene on the X chromosome that is called the exist gene. That gene inactivates the second X chromosome in females. I'm sorry if I'm getting too quickly into the science here. But the point is, the inactivation of the second X chromosome in females is an example of bringing convergence to males and females. In other words, males have one active X chromosome, and in females, you have one active X chromosome because a gene inactivates that second one. In other words, the gene that putatively shows the greatest difference is actually involved in creating convergence and similarity. Okay, so very small differences. Lack of motivation. In other words, why should we do a sex difference study on gene expression in the liver? Is there existing medical literature that suggests that there's probably a pathway there? Is there a biological justification? Is there an interesting theoretical insight to be had? I am interested in the discourse that scientists have among themselves about why we do certain kinds of research. We have limited resources. Shouldn't biologists make an argument about the significance and importance and motivation behind research? Instead, in this field, it seems to be something that one does not need to defend or even argue for. Third, there's a misuse of the terms sex and gender in the description of and a lack of a study of the interaction between the two in the research on sex differences. So a lot of these studies conflate gender-related factors with sex-related factors. In other words, cultural differences that produce biological findings of sex differences, right, versus so-called innate biological differences. Finally, or I guess fourth, there's an overwhelming focus on difference in the description, visual representation, and interpretation of the study results. There are a lot of papers without error bars, and certainly very few papers show the degree of overlap between males and females. In fact, I did not find a single paper that, having set out to find sex differences, did not find them. Finally, there's a neglect of relevant interacting variables, such as age, weight, hormones, reproductive status, nutrition, that are known to affect gene expression. So these are single variable studies that don't look at the relevant interacting variables. So it looks to me like systematic skewing toward findings of sex differences, like what I began this talk with. I'm just going to move on. So I'm just wrapping up here. To conclude, what I hope to have demonstrated to you is that here we have a live example of contemporary science that shows us how the social dimensions, the social context of scientific research is indeed important. It plays a constructive role in the knowledge that is produced. There's a robust conception of genomic sex differences now emerging from genomic research, with often very little criticality about its starting premises or awareness of the existing criticisms in fields like mine. and with a little engagement indeed from ethicists, historians, philosophers, and science studies scholars, not even those with an interest in gender. So let's start a conversation. Ultimately, I argue that this new era of sex difference research calls for a mode of continuous critical engagement, built on a strong historical and philosophical understanding of how gender conceptions work within science, and also a strong understanding of the science itself. The tools and frameworks for thinking about sex in a genomic age are currently being developed. We actually have a choice. It's not just an inevitability. We don't just receive the idea that there's a male genome and a female genome, that males and females are like different species. We actually can have a conversation about this. Do we want the old model, a binary, essentialist, uncritical picture of sex differences? Or do we want a different picture of sex differences in the genome? The genome is offering a picture of diverse and spectrum-like strategies for producing sexed bodies. As I argue in this paper, which Lisa referred to, and elsewhere, we have an opportunity for critical intervention, and we urgently need to have an open methodological, conceptual, and also ethical debate about conceptualizing sex differences in the human genome. So there are good methodological reasons, I hope I've showed you, and ethical reasons to look at sex differences in the genome in new ways, and this is the conversation I hope to open. Thank you.
Dr. Richardson will be happy to take questions from the audience. I should point out, though, that anyone who has a question to ask, because CCEPA records these talks and it's being live streamed as I speak, anyone who has a question, please position yourself and line up behind the microphone right in the middle aisle, please. Don't all rush. That's the spirit.
Every year. I'll give my name as well, Michael Marshall. What if we said that there wouldn't be academic disciplines if there wasn't differences? In other words, they're founded right from the get-go, and I'm speaking perhaps as an amateur historian, in opposition to historians who hate categorizing things and dividing. Isn't it inherent in disciplines to see differences? In other words, one of the biggest unquestioned assumptions they all have is that there are going to be differences, or else there wouldn't be all these different academic and scientific disciplines, which mostly came about in the 19th century during the era of categories and modernism.
So if I understand, there are several layers to that question. One is just noting, right, the location of our contemporary array of disciplines within that moment in the 19th century where we were very deeply invested in differences between humans and analyzing them. The other question I thought to be maybe about interdisciplinarity versus disciplinarity. I hope I'm getting that right. So I've posed myself as somewhat of an interdisciplinary scholar and an advocate of interdisciplinary research. But of course, those critiques and those approaches only are valuable within a disciplinary ecology, right? So one of the roles that philosophers as public intellectuals actually have prided themselves on, or laid claim to, we might say, is translating between the epistemic standards or the knowledge practices of different disciplines, looking very hard conceptually at the commitments of different approaches to research. I hope that this talk exhibited some of the virtue of that. Other disciplines find it quite arrogant, right, that philosophers would venture into that realm. But I do think there's an important space for that, and it plays an important public intellectual role, right? So there's a lot of frustration, it seems to me, among the general public about the extreme specialization and disciplinarity of knowledge production that they often pay for that comes out of the academy. So I am an advocate of informed interdisciplinary research, meaning one is invested in and part of and has knowledge about the different disciplines that one is intervening in.
Thanks for an interesting talk. I'm wondering about the phrase biological motivation. Lack of a biological motivation for the study of sexual difference.
Good.
Could you just expand on that, please?
Good. Yes. Actually, it's something I would like to think about more. What I'm getting at there is the idea that we have this technology available, so why not publish a study that shows the sex differences in our data set that we already have, right? And the intuition here is that I would like researchers to be thinking explicitly about the contribution to knowledge of the research project that they undertake, and that there's a kind of lack of hypothesis-driven research in this area of sex difference studies. So I suppose I could specify it by saying something like hypothesis-driven, where when you write a grant proposal, for example, you need to embed your project within the existing understood frameworks and known biological pathways in a field, and to show that there might be reason and good motivation for the project that you undertake. In this field, I find a kind of flippancy about that. So I'm interested, how would you, are you a biologist?
No.
Okay. So I think by motivation, I mean hypothesis-driven.
Okay. I was just wondering of the term biological is what I was wondering. I've got a philosophical background and wondering what a biological motivation would be. So you're
yes.
saying motivation from within the field of biology sufficient to engage in that research?
Yes, so located within the community-held consensus questions, relevant mechanisms, established research, right, situated as a contribution to that area. Thank you for your question.
Thank you for that talk. I was wondering, and I think others are wondering, that you've given us a very provocative analysis, made us think a lot about how you found a lack of biological significance in sex differences in the literature. Did you do the control experiment where you also examined the literature on any kind of genetic or genomic data? Is this a common flaw within our science, or is it actually just a realm of this particular subdiscipline? I'm thinking that, is there great science that reports no discipline, no difference elsewhere, or do we see the same thing? Small differences.
Great question. So luckily I can defer to Patsopoulos et al., who are known. In fact, there was an article in the New Yorker about Ioannidis and his critiques of genetic epidemiology in general. So they're deeply involved in exactly the question that you just asked. Is the problem of lack of replication endemic across genetic research in general? Yes. Are there a lot of results that are quickly and silently overturned? Yes, absolutely. But in that paper that I quoted, Ioannidis, who looks at lots of research in this field, noted that the research on sex differences was particularly egregious. So, for example, the lack of proper subgroups, or in some of the studies, male-female differences would be compared between a small group of male adolescents and a large group of postmenopausal women, right? Not age-matched. So he felt that this field in particular was egregious, and so chose to focus on it as a general example of epistemic failures in the broader area, fast-moving area of genetic epidemiology. I think there's something to the fact that we're dealing with broad swath claims about humanity rather than claims within specific areas of disease research, for example, that lends itself to sloppy methodology. But as well, this notion of the technological imperatives of this new technology. Well, let's race out and publish the first sex difference study on a particular organ, for example, is part of the context. Thank you.
Hi. I just want to make sure we're talking about the same thing. A gene expressed from your father, this is the implication, causes a different disease than the same gene expressed for your mother. Is this what your talk has been about? Or what your studies, what you've been studying?
Actually, no.
Okay.
So good question.
All right.
What you're talking about is known as maternal and paternal imprinting. And that's its own extremely interesting topic, which is
I
actually
find it fascinating.
Yes.
But it's not what you're talking about.
No, what I'm talking about is whether the same gene, if your brother inherits it from your mother, expresses differently in his body than it expresses in yours. Now,
but
maternal
is that not the same thing as...
No, because right. So the imprinting is referring to the fact that we have two copies of each genetic variant in our body, and one is from your father and one is from your mother. And there is an interesting process within the genome in which you can preferentially monoallelically express one of those gene variants. I'm writing about that in my next book.
Yeah,
because you're right.
Prader-Willi syndrome is the thing that fascinates me that
Yeah.
I've known about for about 35 years. And when I heard it's another disease, by definition, if it's Prader-Willi, you got it from your father. The same gene, you have another disease completely. And I was just enthralled and fascinated by that. You know, just the curiosity. Okay, so I'm sorry. I was just wondering, but it isn't. Okay, thank you.
Thanks for your question.
Hi, thanks for the talk. So I'm not a scientist as well, so I might have misunderstood. But so what exactly, you said there were a lot of claims made that you cited a lot of studies that showed to have a lot of flaws. So what kind of claims were they making? I'm curious. Like specifically, like what were some claims that so, and then a follow-up question to that is, like what field of study were these, like geneticists, were they biologists? Who was it, who were these scientists that were making mistakes? And then, I'm sure they're very smart people. I'm sure they're very good scientists in general, maybe. They got PhDs, they've been trained. So I'm just wondering, like, because it's a pretty big claim to say that you didn't have a control group, or your study was not statistically significant. Well, that's a pretty big, like that's an undergrad error, or lower. So I'm just wondering, like, how do they make these errors? Sorry, this is like 5-part question. Last part is, have they just? I'm sure they've heard you make these sorts of criticisms, so. Have they just kind of been like, oh, she's right, she caught us? Or have they, I guess we better do science better? Or have they kind of been like, have they tried to fight back and saying, no, our studies were better than you're saying they are? So sorry, that's a whole lot, but.
So I'm going to try to answer this in a variety of ways. I was relying mainly on this excellent Journal of American Medicine, Journal of the American Medical Association study, which reviewed 400 studies, right? Or 77 studies making 400 claims. And the studies were in all different areas, but they were all claiming some sort of gene-sex interaction. So an example of a study I looked at was a finding that there's a different genetic architecture between males and females in the case of stuttering. There's also been a series of studies of raw differences in levels of gene expression in the human brain. You might imagine that there's huge difference, or interest in gender differences in the brain and whether they might be genetic. And that study, interestingly, found very few differences in the brain. So those are kinds of studies. Heart disease is another area of avid interest. So those are examples of studies. Now, what has been the uptake and response to these kinds of criticisms? It's interesting because in speaking to scientists, which I enjoy doing, most of the scientists I've encountered are aware of this research, have seen it cited in the literature, but totally capitulate and agree with me that this is just terrible, that they don't do it, other people do it, right? It's egregious, that science is self-correcting, and in a few years people won't be publishing these studies anymore. So they have a very progressivist internal account of their field. I disagree. I think that this research is getting embedded in the literature, and that part of the problem is data mining. In other words, the existing vast swaths of genetic data that just lies there ready to publish a result on sex differences. And so part of the answer to your question also is, what are the different disciplines that these researchers are working in? And that kind of goes to the nut of the issue. What you have are a lot of very smart, well-intentioned individuals working in different fields who have a body of data, say, on the genetics of Alzheimer's or heart disease, who are not gender researchers. They're not trained in sex difference research. That's not their field. They're geneticists, or they work on a particular disease area and they've decided to mine it for sex differences, not being necessarily aware of the conceptual debates and the history around sex differences. So it's a kind of promiscuous transdisciplinary environment where people can just publish results without being deeply embedded in a disciplinary context where they might be exposed to critical conversations about how to do this research.
Thanks for bearing with my questions. Thank you.
Hi, Sharon Batt. I really enjoyed your talk, but I wonder if you could expand a bit on, you mentioned the drug company funding of this particular women's organization, the Society for Women's Health Research. To what extent do you think that funding may have influenced the type of research that was done in genomic research under the auspices, I gather under the auspices of this group? Because I know there is documentation on that group and a transition it went through in its funding sources, I think in the mid-90s.
Good.
So I wonder if you could talk to that.
So the Society for Women's Health Research is itself funded by pharmaceutical companies. And so the question is, so to what extent might the Society for Women's Health Research start advocating for kinds of research that would be of interest and application to their funders? As I mentioned, it's not something I directly studied, but I note it because there's a wide base of scholarship on the role of financial interests in producing scientific bias in other areas. And I think, one of my PhD advisors always said to me, follow the money. And there's great wisdom in that. We require conflict of interest statements by researchers in their publications. We understand that financial interests can influence research results. So I think it's a worthy topic for a fabulous research project. I will also say that there's another interest in addition to enriching their drug research programs. But pharmaceutical companies have also been involved in funding various women's health and women's issues in general as a form of kind of softening their image. So an alternative hypothesis or an additional hypothesis might be the pinkwashing hypothesis, right? That association with these causes helps inure them to criticism in other areas.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much for your talk. I think we're sitting in the middle of a huge paradigm shift here. I think it's so incredibly exciting that we've moved, especially the last decade, to this extent with genome research. I have a big question. You've invited people to the table, and clearly this is going to be a huge creative effort to just look at how to move things forward methodologically. I'm wondering if Lamarck is also invited back to the table, or is he sort of, going to continue to live in the history books?
Could you say more of what you had in mind?
Well, yes. Okay, I'm an adult psychiatrist with an interest across the board, autism fairly recently, and sort of genetic underdiagnosis for patients who present clinically with autism has been a very recent interest. I am currently retired, so these are more theoretical interests. I also have a background in philosophy, and I'm currently studying theology. So trying to pull all this together, it's just all so important, and I just totally love the relational knowledge that you talk about, where we have to think about scientific knowledge in a totally different way, that it's no longer sort of trying to confirm something we thought might be so. We need to be much more open. We need to sort of weave in sort of gender considerations, cultural considerations.
Thank you.
So with all of these sort of, pieces of my background, sometimes it's hard to discern whether something that you're observing in a particular clinical setting comes from perhaps role modeling, say in a very aggressive sort of setting where everybody's ambitious and competitive, and so anybody who comes into that just kind of picks up the virus, or if in fact there's some sort of new way that we might find genes can somehow accommodate some of this, and so it sort of somehow structurally translates into something.
Okay, thank you. So it's interesting because as I am talking about the power of genomics, we are also in a moment where the gene itself is in question, where we have movements like epigenetics, where we have a kind of focus on the apparatus around the gene, the regulatory apparatus, the forms of gene regulation, rather than genetic determinism. So that there is a rich area of potential for rethinking gender and sex, certainly. I would caution that we're not back to Lamarck necessarily no, but it's very much in the air, this idea that we are no longer genetic determinists. Genes change. We learn from our environment. But, ultimately, it has not yet been shown in humans that you can have intergenerational heritable effects. It's not been shown at the level of gene mechanism yet. Stable, permanent intergenerational effects. That's what you'd need to get a real Lamarckian stance. But certainly the idea that the gene is no longer the central thing might be a disruptive force in these kind of old-style genetic differences studies where the genes are going to tell us what's real and what's true and give us the final word. So it's a potential dissident source or a counter-discourse, but we wouldn't want to overstate it, right? We're still talking about very small molecular level mechanisms that are like genes in the sense that they're determinative and that they're biological, right? And so they might just gather the same aura around them, right, and bring about the same kinds of problems of reductionism and determinism that genetic research, I think, has often been rightly criticized for.
Great answer. Thank you very, very much. Hi. So I found it really interesting, very eye-opening, the critique of the study, or the genetic studies that you presented. But I was wondering, is there research that is kind of good research, you think, that is explaining differences? So say like rheumatologic diseases, and why are they more common in women, or why are heart attacks different in men and women, and things like that. And is there good research explaining those differences, or is that still in this kind of epigenetic, I don't know, unknown?
Good. So I'm only here speaking about quantitative genetic difference gene expression studies. There's lots of good sex difference research in the world, and in the book I actually do talk about a couple of great examples of genetic sex difference studies themselves. And what these studies do is that, first of all, they look at the appropriate interacting variables. And these variables usually include hormonal status, reproductive status, and nutritional status, as well as age. They have matched groups along those lines. And then finally, they look at the cultural aspects of gender that could be implicated. And there's an excellent researcher in Berlin who has modeled, I think, a great approach to looking at sex differences in the genome using this interactive systems-based model. Now, researchers will object, well, that's hard to do, I can't get enough study subjects, and so the debate often comes down to practicalities. But this one researcher has shown, she's a heart disease researcher, that her group has shown the plausibility of just what I asked for when I looked at those 5 problems with studies. Her studies don't have any of those problems. They're an excellent example of how you can look at sex differences in the genome in the full context of the body and its enculturated context.
Sorry, what's her name?
Her name is Vera Regitz something that I don't remember right now, but you can email me. Happy to give you the references.
First of all, I'd really like to thank you for doing this research because it just confirmed what I have always said intuitively. We like to harp on our differences, whether it be sexually or racially. We like to focus on the differences rather than the similarities. And what your research has confirmed is that even at a biological level, it is very much more similar than different, which is fabulous. I also wonder if it is not possible to raise children who are not gender biased. Is it possible to have gender unbiased research?
Ooh. Now, as to the first point, should we celebrate the fact that at this very moment it looks like there are a few differences in the human genome and that these differences are not very pervasive and that the real story is somewhere else? You know, I'm ambivalent about that. It's important to make that point, that the differences are not as pervasive and large as is often claimed. They're not as explanatory about sex differences. On the other hand, it just represents another example of looking to science to confirm our social beliefs, right? So that is another form of gender bias. And so, you know, we shouldn't look to science and what we find in the genome to mediate our views about how different males and females are. It's a much broader conversation. As to whether we can not be gender biased, that's related to my answer. So the picture of science that I provided suggested that values, beliefs, assumptions, expectations play a constructive role in scientific knowledge. So based on that view of science, our goal should not be to just eliminate values in science, because that's actually an unrealistic goal. And it would be harmful to science. We need these social processes, peer review, and so on, to produce science. Even we need societies for women's health research to produce journals and contexts for scientists to come together and to find funders. So the goal, if we have a conversation that presumes our goal is to surgically excise all the gender from science and throw it out and then we'll have better science, our good philosophy of science tells us that's misguided. So my argument is that what we should do is cultivate vigorous critical discussion around scientific research on sex differences. That the goal is not to get the gender out of science, but to hone and enlarge our ideas about gender, which we know are critical to our research on sex differences in the sciences.
Very well put. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.